Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode. Today I'm in the watch capital of the Netherlands, the city Maastricht, the city where Bulang & Sons was born, and I'm visiting the restaurant Sank. Today we're talking watches, and on today's menu, the Rolex GMT. Today I will take you on my little guide of the Rolex GMT Master. And maybe let's talk about the name GMT first. Some of you might think that it's just the name that Rolex gave to the watch, but actually there's a bit more behind it. GMT is actually the complication or function of the watch. GMT stands for Greenwich Mean Time, which suggests on the GMT that you can set a second time zone separate from the time zone you are in, which is very handy for example pilots. Which brings me to the point how the GMT came to life. After World War II, the very successful airline company Pan Am needed a watch for the pilots because they were starting to fly international, and they worked with Rolex together to produce a watch which became the GMT Master. And over the years also other people like astronauts, soldiers, but also many famous people were starting to wear this watch. For example, Pussy Galore and James Bond, Marlon Brando, Sylvester Stallone and John Mayer. And that's how this watch created its own cult status. And it all started with the 6542, which is the first GMT reference, like the one I have here in my hands. And this is one from the late 50s with a gilt Swiss-only dial. And of course, this is the first point when we start to see the famous Pepsi bezels, which means that the upper of the bezel is blue and the under of the bezel is red. And the first ones were fitted with a bakelite bezel, which is a primitive form of plastic and very famous to crack and break over time, and also were called back by Rolex because they were very radioactive. And also the original bezel of this one broke and was replaced with a aftermarket bezel. Very great watch still though. And as you can see, the design of this watch is very different to how we know the GMT today. The case is a bit smaller than the modern GMTs. And also, like the Submariner from that time, it still wasn't fitted with crown guards. And this one has a chapter ring dial, which we don't see anymore these days. And I love that this one comes on the folded Jubilee bracelet. I think it suits the watch really nice. Very cool combination. And then we get maybe into the most popular GMT reference, which is the 1675, which is such an interesting reference, partly because it was produced for almost 2 decades, but also because the dial, bezel, bracelet and case variations give you endless styles. And that's why this reference is so great. And the first GMT dials from the 1675 are what we call today gilt dials. And this is one with a super glossy gilt SCOC dial with an open chapter ring. And the vibe of a gilt dial is completely different to a matte dial. So the name gilt comes from the sort of lacquered deep gold color on the dial, which gives it an absolutely different effect than the matte dials. It's almost like a mirror on your wrist. Absolutely mint. The reflection is really there, and I think this one looks super charismatic with the Pepsi bezel, which has been faded. The blue turned lighter, the red turned to an almost orange color. And I think the combination of this watch is stunning. Really one of the best gilt dials on the market. And this one is from 1966, which means that it's one of the later gilt dials before Rolex moved to the matte dials. And this is where it gets super interesting for me, because with the matte dials you have 5 different type of mark dial variations, with the Mark 1 with the long E, which means that the E is a little bit longer than on the other mark dials, being maybe the most popular, and the Mark 3 being the most collectible, which is the radial dial, which the lume plots are a little bit closer into the dial. And of course, this is where we also start to see the really rare dials like the Omani Kanja, the uber rare dial, and also the UAE dials. At the moment there's a really hype going on that many collectors want a very dark blue and dark red Pepsi bezel, but for me the strength of the GMT has always laid in the fact that many bezels changed or faded color. And that's really unique because no bezel is exactly the same then anymore and gives a GMT such a different character. You put a different bezel on a GMT, a different Pepsi bezel, and it just changes the watch completely, like for example on the gilt dial I showed you. And I think that's really one of the biggest strengths of the 1675. And also we shouldn't forget that the 1675 was also made with black bezels, which can also change color to a grey bezel, which also looks super nice. And maybe one of my favorite bezels on a 1675 is the Root Bear. Which brings me to one of my favorite GMTs, which is the GMT in a two-tone colorway. And this is what we call the root bear today, because of the root bear bezel, and I think this one looks absolutely stunning. Very charismatic look with the two-tone Jubilee bracelet, the sort of oxblood burgundy dial with the nipple dial, which means that the hour plots are a little bit smaller in the form of a sort of nipple. And this is what we call today a Clint Eastwood, because Clint Eastwood was famous for wearing a sort of similar watch. And I think a two-tone GMT is one of the most underrated sport Rolexes out there. I think it looks super cool, super stylish, especially on this Jubilee bracelet. What many people forget about is that also the steel one, but also the steel gold and gold GMTs were also made with Jubilee and oyster bracelets. And I think this absolutely looks super cool. Super charismatic watch, love it. After the 16755, Rolex introduced a new reference, which is the 16750. And on this reference we see in the first place the matte dials and later the glossy dials. And then Rolex introduced after this reference a new reference, which is the 16700, which was the last reference of the GMT Master, which for a fun fact was produced during the same time as the GMT Master 2, which is the replacement of the GMT Master. And that's really cool because Rolex produced two GMT Masters references at the same time. The difference between the GMT Master and the GMT Master 2 is that from now on you could also set the 24-hour hand independently. And with the new GMT Master, the GMT Master 2, Rolex introduced also a new bezel type on the 16760, which is the Coke bezel. And the Coke bezel is just like the Pepsi bezel, but they replaced the blue of the Pepsi bezel with black, which represents the colors of Coca-Cola. That's why we call it the Coke bezel. And then Rolex introduced another new reference, which is the 16710, which replaced the 16760. And I'm also wearing a 16710 today, which is this one. And this reference was produced from the late 90s until they replaced it with the ceramic GMT, which is the modern GMT. And I think this one looks super cool. Very cool reference. Was also made with the Pepsi bezel, the black bezel and the Coke bezel. This one has a super nice faded Pepsi bezel. The red turned pink, and I think it suits the GMT very nice. But I think this one will be very cool to wear in upcoming days.
Berend, if you had to choose any one of these you have on the table, which one would you pick?
Well, that's a hard question. Of course, the 6542 is very historically important. I love this one on a Jubilee. I think it looks really cool. The gilt dial, yeah, this one is just perfect. It's absolutely mint. And I think the bezel faded super nice. I think that's a really cool combination. But personally, looking from my age point of view, my choice would have been between these two. I really like the 16710 with that faded inlay. But I think today, I will go for the funky choice. I will go for the Clint Eastwood style. This one is super cool. Yeah, this is my choice. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my GMT video today. I want to thank my good friend from the restaurant Sank for letting us filming in this great location here today. And if you're planning to visit the watch capital of the Netherlands anytime soon, make sure you come here to eat that delicious shrimp croquettes. I hope to see you next time and stay safe.